Oh.
The coastline of San Diego stretched out before us, bathed in a palette of golden light that softened the edges of the world. Theo pedaled ahead of me. His laughter carried back on the breeze, as if it was trying to pull me out of my thoughts. I smiled despite myself. He called me Amelie, a name Mark had coined for me in our younger days, and one Theo had clung to. It sounded sweeter coming from him now than I cared to admit. Mark's absence was still a shadow in my chest, one I carried with me no matter how brightly the sun shone. 2 years had passed since his heart had simply stopped one chilly morning, leaving me grappling with a silence that had never felt heavier. But Theo had filled that silence in a way no one else could. My grandson had always been restless and full of cheer. Mark used to call him a windy boy, saying he'd blow into a room and rearrange everything without even trying. At 25, Theo's spirit hadn't waned. He'd started a small flower business, and though his venture was modest, I admired his tenacity. We shared a love for blooms, a connection I didn't fully understand but cherished all the same. Perhaps it was because flowers had been Mark's thing, too. Our family had been entwined in petals for as long as I could remember. As we stopped at a bend in the path, Theo looked back at me, his curls catching the sunlight. "Come on, Amelie," he called, his voice boyish despite the years that had passed since I'd first held him in my arms. "You're riding like we've got all day." I feigned a glare but pressed harder on the pedals, my legs burning in protest. By the time I caught up to him, he was already standing beside his bike, looking out over the ocean. His hands rested casually on his hips, but his face was uncharacteristically serious. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, not looking at me. I nodded. "It always is." Theo turned to me then, his gaze lingering. "You okay, Amelie?" There was something in his voice that made my throat tighten. He had this way of seeing me, of knowing when the cracks in my composure ran too deep for me to mend on my own. I wasn't sure how he'd come by such wisdom, but I suspected it had something to do with Mark. My husband had always been able to read me, too. "I'm fine," I said, brushing my hair back as if that would make my words more convincing. Theo smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've been taking those pills again, haven't you?" My chest constricted. He knew about the sleeping pills. I wasn't sure how, but he did. "Sometimes," I admitted softly. "It's not easy to sleep." He tilted his head, his expression gentle but unwavering. "Amelie, you can't rely on those. They're not the answer." His words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they were. I had leaned too heavily on the small orange bottle Mark had never approved of. But how else was I supposed to find peace when my nights were riddled with ghosts and echoes? "I'll manage," I murmured, though the conviction in my voice faltered. Theo reached out, his hand brushing mine. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm here." It was such a simple statement, but it unraveled something inside me. I squeezed his hand lightly, a gesture of gratitude more than anything else. We stood there for a while, the sound of the waves below filling the space between us. There were no words to mend the loss we shared, but in Theo's presence, the ache felt less sharp. That evening, the San Diego sky was awash in hues of lavender and peach as the sun dipped below the horizon. I had fallen asleep earlier than usual, the weight of the day finally catching up with me. Perhaps it was the hour spent at Theo's shop, helping him arrange bouquets and sweeping petals from the floor, or maybe it was the comforting rhythm of our routine. Whatever the reason, I drifted into slumber without even realizing it, my book slipping from my hands onto the bedside table. Downstairs, Theo had called out, his voice carrying up the stairs. "Amelie, I made tea. Want some?" There was no answer. He waited a beat, his brow furrowing. "Amelie," he tried again, his voice louder this time, concern creeping in around the edges. When I didn't respond, he climbed the stairs, his footfalls soft but steady. When he reached my room, he found me curled up on my side, the blanket half draped over me. My breathing was slow and even, a faint smile lingering on my lips as if I'd been dreaming of something pleasant. The sight seemed to calm him, his broad shoulders relaxing as he leaned against the doorframe for a moment, watching. "You really knocked out, huh, Amelie?" he murmured under his breath, his lips curving into a fond smile. He stepped inside quietly, pulling the blanket up to cover me properly. For a moment, he stood there, his hand lingering on the fabric as he gazed down at me. He didn't often let himself pause long enough to think about how much I had done for him. The countless sacrifices, the tireless days of raising him with love and patience. Now it seemed to hit him all at once. Theo sat down beside me on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb my rest. He listened to the sound of my breathing, rhythmic and steady, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. How many times had I stayed by his bedside when he was sick as a child, soothing him with songs or stories until he fell asleep? How often had I chased away his fears, carried his burdens, and loved him unconditionally? Now, as he watched me, it felt like the roles had shifted. I wasn't just his grandmother. I was his anchor, the one person who knew him completely. His hand moved almost instinctively, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. My skin, softened by age, bore the lines of a life well lived, a testament to years of love, laughter, and loss. But in that moment, all Theo could see was the woman who had always been there for him, who had given so much of herself to ensure he could thrive. He swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. "You don't even know how much you mean to me, do you?" he whispered, his voice low and tinged with emotion. "How much I owe you. How much I—" He trailed off, his words caught somewhere between reverence and hesitation. For a while, he just sat there, lost in his thoughts. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the night outside, the occasional chirp of crickets filtering through the open window. He let his fingers graze lightly over the back of my hand, marveling at how small and delicate it felt in his own. There was a tenderness in his touch, a quiet reverence that spoke of everything he couldn't put into words. As he sat there, memories flooded his mind. Memories of our walks along the coastline, of laughter shared over bike rides, of the nights when I had stayed up late to help him with school projects or comforted him after his first heartbreak. He thought about how I had been there for him in ways no one else ever had, how I had filled the void left by his parents' absence with unwavering love. And now he thought it was his turn. Theo stayed with me for what felt like hours, his mind churning with unspoken thoughts and emotions. When he finally stood to leave, he bent down and pressed a kiss to my temple, his lips lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Amelie," he whispered, his voice thick with affection. "Sleep well." The next morning, I awoke to the scent of fresh coffee wafting up from the kitchen. I found Theo bustling about, his apron tied around his waist as he prepared breakfast. "Morning, sleepyhead," he teased, flashing me a grin. "You were out like a light last night. I was starting to think you'd sleep straight through until lunch." I chuckled, brushing a hand through my hair. "I guess I needed it. Thank you for checking on me." He looked up from the stove, his expression softening. "Always." That day, we headed to his shop together, a routine that had become a kind of balm for my grief. The smell of flowers greeted us as we entered, their vibrant colors filling the space with life. Theo handed me an apron, and we spent the morning arranging bouquets, our hands working in tandem. He asked for my opinion on color schemes and laughed when I scolded him for being too messy with the ribbons. "You know you're better at this than I am," he said at one point, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "Maybe I should just retire and let you take over." I rolled my eyes. "Retire at 25? You'd miss this too much." He grinned, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his gaze, something unspoken, hovering between us like a secret neither of us was ready to voice. Our relationship had always been close, but now it felt as if we were navigating uncharted territory, the boundaries shifting in ways that left us both unsure. Later that evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, I felt the weight of his gaze on me. When I turned to look at him, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of gratitude and something else I couldn't quite place. "Amelie," he began, his voice tentative, "I just want you to know, I wouldn't be who I am without you." The sincerity in his words took me by surprise, and for a moment, all I could do was reach over and squeeze his hand. "And I wouldn't be who I am without you, Theo." That night, the house was quieter than usual, wrapped in the kind of stillness that made time feel slower. Outside, The ocean waves whispered their endless song, a sound that had always soothed me, even in my loneliest moments. I had gone to bed earlier than usual again, my body weary, but my mind at peace after another day spent with Theo. Unbeknownst to me, he lingered downstairs longer than usual, his thoughts unsettled. He tried distracting himself with a book, the TV, even his phone, but nothing could hold his attention. His mind kept drifting back to me, curled up in my room, fast asleep. Finally, unable to resist the pull, he found himself climbing the stairs, his footsteps muffled against the soft carpet. When Theo pushed the door open, he found me just as he had the night before. My small frame nestled beneath the blanket, my silver hair spread across the pillow like a halo. My face was turned toward the window, bathed in the faint light of the moon. I looked peaceful, even fragile, in a way that tugged at something deep inside him. He crossed the room quietly, pulling the chair from my writing desk to sit beside the bed. For a long moment, he simply watched me, his elbows resting on his knees as he leaned forward. My breathing was steady, my chest rising and falling in a soothing rhythm. There was something almost sacred about the moment, a stillness that felt both comforting and charged. Theo's eyes softened as he reached out to adjust the blanket, tucking it more securely around me. His fingertips grazed my hand briefly, and he paused, as if startled by the warmth of my skin. He let his hand linger, his thumb tracing small, absent-minded circles against the back of mine. "Amelie," he whispered, though I couldn't hear him. "You don't even know how much you've done for me, how much you've given me. How could I ever repay you?" The silence of the room offered no answers, but he didn't seem to mind. For him, just being there in my presence was enough. As the minutes turned into hours, Theo remained by my side, unwilling to leave. At one point, he shifted from the chair to sit on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb my slumber. His hand found mine again, and he held it lightly, his thumb brushing over the delicate lines etched into my skin by time. While Theo sat beside me, I drifted deeper into my dreams. They were sweet, magical dreams, dreams of sunlight filtering through wildflower meadows, of laughter echoing along the San Diego coastline, of Mark's warm smile and Theo's boyish laugh intertwining in a melody that filled my heart with joy. I felt weightless, free, as if every burden had been lifted. In my dream, Theo was there too, his hand steady in mine, guiding me toward a horizon bathed in gold. When I stirred slightly in my sleep, Theo froze, his breath catching. But I didn't wake. Instead, I turned toward him, a faint smile curving my lips as if his presence had followed me into my dreams. He couldn't help but smile back, even though I couldn't see it. Eventually, Theo stretched out beside me, his movements tentative and slow. He propped himself up on one elbow, his head resting in his hand as he continued to watch me. There was something protective in the way he looked at me, as if he were guarding me not just from the world, but from the weight of my own memories. "You've always taken care of me," he murmured softly. "Maybe it's my turn now." As the hours passed, Theo let his own eyes close, lulled by the rhythmic sound of my breathing and the warmth of the room. He stayed close, his hand brushing against mine every now and then, as if reassuring himself that I was still there. When dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight painted the room in soft hues of pink and gold. I stirred awake slowly, my dreams slipping away like wisps of smoke. For a moment, I didn't realize I wasn't alone. Then I turned my head and saw Theo, still half asleep beside me, his face relaxed in the gentle light. "Theo!" I whispered, my voice soft with surprise. His eyes fluttered open, and he blinked at me, a sheepish smile forming on his lips. "Morning, Amelie." I stared at him for a moment, my heart swelling with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "Did you stay here all night?" He nodded, sitting up and rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't mean to fall asleep. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." My chest tightened, and I reached out to touch his hand. "You didn't have to do that, sweetheart." "I wanted to," he said simply, his voice earnest. "You've always been there for me. I want to be here for you too." Something in his words melted the last of my reservations. I squeezed his hand, my eyes glistening. "You already are." Theo. From that morning on, something shifted between us. Our bond, already close, deepened in ways that were both comforting and confusing. Theo's presence became a constant in my life, a source of warmth and support that I found myself relying on more and more. And yet, there was an unspoken tension between us, a quiet undercurrent that neither of us dared to acknowledge. It was in the way his hand lingered on mine a moment too long, in the way his gaze softened when he looked at me, in the way my heart quickened whenever he was near. It was a closeness that defied explanation, a connection that felt as natural as it was unexpected. And as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead us, or if I even wanted to stop it. The days in San Diego began to take on a new rhythm, one that revolved around Theo and me. The mornings were filled with laughter and shared routines, and the nights held an intimacy that neither of us spoke of but both felt deeply. It was as if the lines between us had blurred, the roles of grandmother and grandson dissolving into something entirely our own, something sacred and unspoken. One evening, after the shop had closed for the day, Theo suggested we take a walk along the beach. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The cool breeze carried with it the salty tang of the ocean, and the sound of the waves rolling against the shore was as comforting as a lullaby. Theo walked beside me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his shoulders relaxed in a way that made him seem younger. "Amelie," he said after a long silence, his voice soft but deliberate, "do you ever think about how much has changed since Mark passed?" The mention of Mark's name was like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling through my chest. "I think about it all the time," I admitted. Losing him felt like losing a part of myself. Theo nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I miss him too, but I'm grateful for the way things have brought us closer." I stopped walking, turning to look at him. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "So am I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. Theo smiled at me then, a smile that was both boyish and profound, and we continued walking, our steps falling into sync. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual, as I often did these days. My body was growing slower, my energy ebbing sooner. But my dreams were still vivid, filled with moments that felt more real than the waking world. In them, Theo and I were always together, walking, laughing, sharing secrets that no one else knew. When I awoke in the middle of the night, I wasn't alone. I opened my eyes to find Theo sitting in the armchair near the window, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the curtains. He wasn't asleep. He was watching me, his expression tender and contemplative. "Theo," I murmured, my voice thick with sleep. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to answer. "I couldn't sleep," he said finally. "I just wanted to check on you." I propped myself up on one elbow, studying him in the dim light. "You shouldn't worry about me so much, sweetheart." "I can't help it," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're the most important person in my life, Amelie." His words sent a warmth spreading through my chest, but they also stirred something deeper, something more complicated. "Come here," I said, patting the edge of the bed. "Sit with me." Theo crossed the room slowly, his movements careful, as though he were afraid of disturbing the fragile quiet of the moment. He sat down beside me, his presence steady and reassuring. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with the kind of understanding that didn't require words. "Do you remember," I began softly, "when you were little and you used to crawl into bed with me and Grandpa after you had a bad dream?" Theo chuckled, the sound low and rich. "I remember Grandpa complaining that I kicked him in my sleep." "You always ended up sprawled across the bed," I said, smiling at the memory. "Mark would grumble, but he secretly loved it. He loved you so much." Theo's smile faded slightly, replaced by a wistfulness that tugged at my heart. "I miss him," he said simply. "I do too," I whispered, my hand finding his. "Every day." He looked down at our joined hands, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Amelie. After he passed, you held everything together. So did you, I said, my voice firm. You were my rock, Theo. You still are. He met my gaze then, his eyes searching mine in a way that made my breath catch. There was something unspoken in his expression, something that had been building between us for weeks, maybe months. It was a connection that went beyond words, beyond reason, and it both terrified and exhilarated me. I didn't pull my hand away when his grip tightened, nor did I object when he shifted closer. The warmth of his presence was comforting, grounding, and yet it stirred something within me that I couldn't quite name. I had never felt this way before, not with anyone but Mark, and the realization was both startling and inevitable. Amelie, Theo said softly, his voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to explain this, but you mean everything to me, more than I can put into words. My heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice. Theo, I began, but I didn't know how to continue. The emotions swirling inside me were too complex, too tangled to untangle in the moment. He reached up then, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was light, almost reverent, and I felt my eyes welling with tears. I just want you to know, he said, that I'll always be here for you, no matter what. I nodded, unable to speak, and leaned into his touch. The room seemed to shrink around us, the rest of the world fading into the background. All that existed in that moment was the two of us, the unspoken connection between us growing stronger with every passing second. Theo stayed with me through the night, his presence a quiet reassurance. When dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, I woke to find him still beside me, his head resting on the edge of the bed. His face was peaceful, free of the usual mischief that so often danced in his eyes. I reached out, my hand brushing lightly against his cheek. He stirred slightly but didn't wake, and I allowed myself a moment to simply look at him, to take in the depth of my feelings without the burden of explanation or guilt. Whatever this was between us, this connection, this bond, it was ours, and for now, that was enough.
Bye.